Now I'm going to show you how to add a Bootstrap slideshow. I'm going to show you how to use the documentation. And once I show you this, how to implement this, I'm going to leave it up to you to figure out how to add a couple more components. So the slideshow is called the carousel. And I'm just going to start with the first most basic example. I'm going to copy the code straight in here. Let's look at what the code contains. There's an ID that identifies the slideshow. Now you could have multiple slideshows on the page, and each slideshow would have a unique ID. So this ID can be anything you want. I'm going to call it carousel example. And then the classes are specific. So there's a carousel called slide, and there's a class called carousel and a class called slide that are on the outer wrapper. There's also a data attribute called carousel. It's data ride. And if you're not familiar with data attributes, they are used to add additional information in a tag that's picked up by JavaScript. Data tags or data attributes rather can be very useful when you're integrating JavaScript in with your HTML. HTML is not a great storage system. It's very slow in the way that retrieving data off of HTML is very slow. So you don't want to over rely on data attributes to pass information, although it definitely has some very important uses. Then inside the outer wrapper, there's an inner wrapper. And the inner wrapper contains only slides. And this is important once we go through and start adding other elements to the slideshow. Okay, so the class is, the outer wrapper is carousel inner, and then we have carousel items. Now these div blocks, they don't need to be div blocks. They could really be any block element that you choose, as long as they have the correct IDs and classes. That's the key thing. So for example, for the slide, we have an image in here, and let's say there might be a caption. It would be totally appropriate, instead of using a div, to use a figure. For example, you could use a figure tag with a fig caption inside it. You can put as much inside the slide as you want. You can put a single image, you can put in multiple images, you can put in text. The slide is this this wrapper here. The slide is not the image, so that's something to keep in mind. You have a lot of flexibility with a Bootstrap slideshow. So I created, I added 3 images to the directory, so I'm going to link to those. The images can be any size as long as they're the same size. In WordPress, we're going to look at how you can make WordPress automatically crop the images, so the administrator doesn't have to worry about cropping them, before uploading them. WordPress will take care of it for you. But for this first demo that we're doing, when we're setting our template up in just the HTML, we do need to manually size the photographs. Alt tags are actually really important these days. There's been a lot of lawsuits around accessibility, and this is one of the things that that's considered important for accessibility. All right, so now let's take a look at our page. Okay, and here's the slideshow. Now, There's no, at this point, there's no navigation or no previous and back buttons, but it does work. Now to add the controls, let's look at the next example. You can see that the controls are down here. Okay, they're not inside, they're outside of this inner wrapper. I'll put them at the bottom as it shows here. Now one thing to note is that this href needs to match the outer wrapper ID. Now if I refresh this, I should have some nice beautiful arrows. If the IDs don't match, by the way, the sliders won't, the arrows won't work. And one thing that could happen, let's say, for example, you had multiple slideshows and you didn't change the IDs, the slideshow would actually advance a different, like, so let's say I had a slideshow below here, and I call this one 2, but I don't change the IDs down here. Watch what happens. It actually changes the one above it. So that's what will happen if the IDs don't match. Okay, now let's add some indicators. So the indicators are on top here. One thing you'll note is that they have an ID in this data target that matches the ID, and then it has an index. If you've taken a programming class or 2 or 3 or 4, you're probably familiar with the idea that of indexes, and that the index refers to, in this case with HTML, JavaScript, the index refers to the which element you're referring to. So this would be the first one, second one, and third one. Now indexes in most programming languages, in most contexts, start with 0. There are some cases where the index will start with 1, but that's rare. Usually 0 is the first item. So 0, 1, 2, that's how they're referred. So if you were to add in an additional slide, you would have 0, 1, 2, and 3. Okay. You'll notice also how the active class is also on the first indicator. You can see how that works. If the active class were not on the first indicator, I'll show you what will happen. Nothing too major in this case. It'll still work, but you'll notice they're all gray. Once I click on an indicator, it will light up. But in order to make it, as good as we can, we want the active class to be on this first item. Now the next thing we can do is add captions. Okay, and so the way we're going to do this is we're just going to copy this markup from inside here. You don't necessarily need to use this markup to add a caption. You can style it however you want, but this does set up a nice system for you. Okay, so you can see how easy that was to implement. Now, This style can really be anything you want. There's no reason why. Sorry, there's no reason why it has to look a specific way. Here's my slides. So, for example, what I would want to do is I'd want to style it for the according to the outer wrapper. I could use the class carousel. That might be the best option. In case I had multiple carousels, I'd probably want them all to be styled the same way. Now it's important that I have a class or an ID, and not just in front of the H5 and not just H5, because I want this to be styled specifically for the carousel. There might be an H5 somewhere else on the site that has a different style. So I want to be more specific here. Let's say 3M. Oops. Okay, and you can see how it just got larger. You could also change the positioning. You just have to dig around in here and find how that's done. So you would, by the way, that style I just made for the H5, the way you would implement that on your template is you would put that style in a separate style sheet that you would link to separately. So I often like to do it this way, to style it in the browser and then just copy it and put it into the CSS after I've worked it out. Oops. Especially like this is only one rule, but if you have a lot of rules, it's really easy to just copy and paste. Now, one thing to note is that this also has some additional classes, which I encourage you to look through Bootstrap to look at all the documentation of the different classes they have. But you'll see it has D none, so it has D, MD block. And so what this is doing is that it is when it's smaller, it's hiding the caption. And that is one solution for how to manage the reduced size. So in other words, when I have less size, the text runs out of room, and that can often be a problem. And so one solution is to hide it. Although I will say, in my experience, that is not a solution that I have ever seen a client like. I've never seen a client like the idea of not seeing the text on a phone. They always want to see it. So this is part of the default, but I don't particularly think this is a great idea. Just take this out. Should be fine. Actually, let's modify this. There you go. You could put a media query in to reduce the size of the text when it gets on a smaller width. That would be a better solution. Well, I hope that this is helpful and explains to you how to use Bootstrap components. And I really do hope that you enjoy the process of adding some additional components. Some of them the slider has a lot of functionality. Some of these components have a lot of features, and some of them are really very simple.